Hello, BookTube. I'm here to have a little discussion of Saul David Zulu, the heroism and tragedy of the Zulu War of 1879. I finished reading this sort of late Sunday night, early Monday morning. It took a long time to read it. I took basically about 6 days to read it. It's not that big, it's 400 and some pages long. Uh, but I'd like to discuss a few things about this, sort of a general history of the Zulu War, um, concentrating on us on Dawana and Rorke's Drift, with some reference to the two films that have been made, the Zulu Dawn in 1979 for Isan Dawana, and the 1964 Zulu film called Zulu for Rorke's Drift. Uh, and sort of the implications, of the events of 1879 as well. Just to sort of back up partially before the events of 1879, um, there were a part of the British government that were spurred on by the idea of confederation, having succeeded in Canada in 1867 with confederation, and they wanted to do confederation in South Africa and unite all the groups, the territories that were there, in order so they wouldn't unite against British rule. And it was toyed with during the 1870s after Canada, but it never really, they didn't think it would work. However, in 1878, they sent Sir Bartol Frere as the High Commissioner of South Africa to do just that. He was paid an enormous salary, more twice as much as his predecessors, and he was promised sort of honors and heaps of gold if he succeeded. So he arrives there, and he does see sort of some uh, problems in the way of confederation. And again, like, I just want to stop here for a second and say I'm putting sort of general strokes and broad sort of things. I don't take everything as an exact, and some of them are interpretations of some historians as well that I'm going to talk about. But yeah, he sort of arrived. He saw that there was a big problem would have been the native groups. So in 1878, he had, like, there was a few skirmishes, wars against the Xhosa and a few others. But he saw Zulu, the Zulu land, as a big one, and the Transvaal. Transvaal was recently annexed by Britain, but the Boers, the Afrikaners, didn't like it, didn't like the idea, so they balked against it. They didn't want to, and there was also disputed territory between Transvaal and Zululand, and because the Boers were encroaching on Zulu territory. Ketsueo, I think it was, that said something to the effect that the Boer is like a leapfrog. They'll leap and leap and leap, and the next thing you know, they're in your tent. Um, so they didn't have any love for the Boers. They constantly had fighting with them, even way back into the 1830s, when the Boers left in the 1820s and late 20s, 30s. They left Cape Town and went over the Drakensberg Mountains on their great treks. They ran into Zulu, so there was no great love between them. But Bartle Freer, sorry, it seems like, and I don't know, as I say, I haven't read any of the details of this, but it seems like he was playing them off each other a little bit. He was at the beginning placating Zulu, and then and then he went to the Transvaal side and gave, in late 1878, gave Ketsueo, the Zulus, just huge demands to say, this is what you've got to do, or we're gonna start war. And the Zulu didn't want war. They were fairly peaceful at that time. They did not want war. They just want to be left alone, as far as I could tell, and sort of live their lives. But they're being hemmed in on other corners and being tried to dictate to by the British and Bartle Freer at the time. And basically the ultimatum was, if you don't secede to these, or say yes to all these demands by January 11th, 1879, a state of war will be between the British Empire and the Zulu. So this, in some ways, quietened down the the Transvaal a little bit, and they were hoping to get support from the Transvaal, but there wasn't much. There was a few that came over with a sort of family and private sort of military or horse contingents, but very few. But they did bolster up soldiers along the border there, the disputed area with Zulu lands. So it sort of, for the moment, Transvaal was sort of quiet to a certain extent. So on January the 11th, Lord Chelmsford led a column. He had 3 columns, and he led one column across the Tugela River to go to Isandlwana and encamp there. And by the 22nd, they were there at Isandlwana. Another column went up sort of more coastal area to Ishawe to set up a relief station, a depot for supplies. However, it became sort of a siege situation for many months until Wolsey could get there and end the siege. But getting back to Isandlwana, on the 22nd, on the early morning of the 22nd, Chelmsford decided to split his column, take a huge number of soldiers, and sort of gallivant through the countryside looking for the Zulu. He thought they'd be attacking from a certain area, but he misunderstood them. He underestimated their power, their numbers. He underestimated their military prowess, especially. And he sort of was led by the Zulu wanting him to go somewhere else, while the main army of 25,000 was converging on this on Dawana. And so in the afternoon of the 25th, Isandlwana camp was left in charge by Colonel Pauline. Another colonel that was had a horse contingent. Lieutenant Colonel Durnford was ordered to go to Isandlwana and sort of help if there was any problems, to bolster up support. And there'll be more about this in a few moments, because this is where some interesting things lie after the attack. So he did that. He was there with his horses, and in the afternoon, sort of mid-afternoon, the Zulu attacked. Just quickly and surprisingly. They didn't even get a chance to decamp, in a sense, because normally they would lower their tents, so they have clean line of fire. They didn't even have a chance to do that. Pauline was, he didn't have that much, I don't think, in experience of battle. And Durnford did, but he took his horses out to meet some of the head on out further out, a mile or two from the camp. But they were overwhelmed and pushed back, and finally, in sort of a ravine, sort of old water course. There's certain African names for these land features, but some of them are hard to pronounce. So I'll just skip over them because I don't even know them well enough myself. But that's where he made his last stand. He was killed by the Zulu. The Zulu came on. There were about 1,200 soldiers at Isandlwana. Most of them were killed. There was only a few that escaped, and there's controversial stories of some of them that were considered coward, and they ran off and they wouldn't stay to fight. But the situation was that there were no prisoners, so they had to fight to the death, basically. So, and it was over by nightfall anyway. And to make matters worse, that this was a huge black spot for British Army. The failure, the failure of the army to succeed, but also too for the British public, who found out in February. The Zulu, part of their culture was that if the foe fought well, that they would disembowel them to allow their spirit to leave. And it was a ritual thing that they did. It wasn't that they were mutilating them just mutilation purposes at all. There was in the culture of Zulu a reason for this, but this was not obviously looked at in that way by the British public or the British government. So it was horrifying. So, but while this was going on, while the attack started, there were messages sent to Chelmsford by Pauline and others to say, we're being attacked, come help. And many of them were sent. He disregarded them, thinking that, well, they can't be, and even if they are, it's going to be a small force, they can take care of it. He sent a few people with telescopes up to a higher level to look, and he was told that the tents weren't lowered, so therefore there was no battle really happening. There was not much happening. But he finally did go back, and it was late that night, 22nd. So he arrived back at Isandlwana in the early hours of the morning, and just kept on going. They saw the carnage, but they didn't stay, and they just kept moving back, retreating. And so basically, somebody had to be blamed. Like the way things work was, somebody had to be held accountable. Somebody had to be blamed for the failure of Isandlwana. And there were a large part of the government, British government, that believed it was Chelmsford. There was an inquiry in it, but he passed it and he was okay. But there were still many, many questions, but somehow he survived. It was partially because of others rallying around him close by, and the Queen also thought he could do no wrong, thought highly of him. But they turned on Lieutenant Colonel Durnford and blamed him. They said that he was given command of the Isandlwana, which was not the case. He was never given command. Pauline was in command. But they were overwhelmed regardless. But Durnford took the brunt of it. And like I said, they just went, when they went back, they saw the carnage, they just kept on going. They left everything there. So nobody went back. And this was January 26th. Nobody went back to Isandlwana from the British Army, as far as I can tell, until in May. So many months later. And I think around that and into June, they finally got to burying some of the dead that were left there in the field for months. Chelmsford didn't want anybody to go back. He used excuses to say that, or his reasons. I'm putting words in excuses, but his reasons were that they could be attacked by other Zulu. We don't have the resources or the time and the people to go do this. Well, we're going to invade again with a bigger force. That they got more men and equipment from England to do another invasion. But critics have seen this as he did it because he was afraid of people finding basically the orders that he gave, the actual orders that he gave Durnford. He was hoping the elements would take care of any kind of incriminating documents for this. Now, there's an afterword in Saul David's about this, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But, I can say, I might as well deal with it now. That when they went back, they did find, like, there's one thing that was known. They did find this, I forget now whose was it. It was an adjutant of Chelmsford who kept the book, and he had a copybook of every order that was written by Chelmsford, and the order for Durnford to go and help was in there, but there was no order to say that he was to take command, so that was never sent. This was given back to the person who owned this. They found it. However, it never came to light. It wasn't said because they had at that time said, yes, this order was given by Chelmsford. They backed Chelmsford up. And it wasn't until the 60s that this was all this came to light for this. But there was also somebody else who found Durnford's body, and potentially the order that actually was given was in his coat pocket. This person pocketed it and he was going to use it probably to sort of blackmail or curry favor with Chelmsford to get better, for favors in the future, or assignments, or being transferred to X, Y, Z. That didn't happen, but whether or not he kept the papers or not, I don't know. I don't think that ever came to light. So it was a bit of a controversy for a long time, but a lot of people believe that Chelmsford he should have been held responsible for this. And eventually he was replaced. Um, a few months, like around August, I think it was, a replacement went out, General Wolseley. But he got wind of this. Chelmsford got wind of this, and he forced his way into more battle to try to win the war and try to, change his sort of to erase the stain on him. That if he actually finished the war, and he did, he had the Battle of Ulundi. But anyway, let's get back to Isandlwana. So the night of the 22nd, the Zulu decimate Isandlwana. A large contingent of the 20 or 25,000 there, a lot of them went to march to Rorke's Drift and connected with others, I think, that were there waiting to attack Rorke's Drift. Now, Rorke's Drift was on the river, Tugela River, I think it was, and there were a few survivors, so they knew at some point what happened at Isandlwana and that the Zulu were coming. So they had an hour or so to prepare or do something. There were two lieutenants, Lieutenant Chard and Lieutenant Brumhead. Now, they wanted to flee, and there was an assistant commissary soldier who was in charge of the commissary, who talked them around and saying, well, if we flee, we're going to be slaughtered. And his idea was to entrench, build barricades from the mealie bags, supplies that they had, mealie, which was corn. It's corn, but it's like an Indian corn. I think it's a slightly different breed than normal corn that we see here. But anyway, corn, anyway. And other supplies in boxes like biscuits. So they built these barricades by everything, with wagons, everything that they could find. And between some buildings as well. So when the Zulu attacked, they had a barricade. And then they had a fallback position. There was a hospital there, so they were wounded in hospital. The ones were given guns, and holes were made into the walls so they could shoot out of at Zulu. So they did this, and within an hour or so, the first onslaught came. I think it was about the second one that they had to fall back to their secondary position, but that left the hospital sort of exposed. So Zulu attacked the hospital, and this was getting on to nightfall now. It was dark. And the Zulu burnt, because of the thatched roof, they burnt the roof, and it burnt it down. So there was only one doorway in, and there were no doorways sometimes to a lot of the rooms. So they had to cut through other rooms and then, defend, and while the sick were sort of taken out. Several of them were killed, but they were able to do this, and at nighttime they were able to still fight because the Zulu could be seen in silhouette from the light of the burning building. Otherwise, they might have, with a few attacks, they might have completely been overrun. So they successfully defended Rorke's Drift. The Zulu left the next morning. There were quite a few dead. There were thousands, possibly 800 or so dead Zulu. And not a huge amount of British soldiers, but they fared fairly well. But it was a victory. And because to the public, Isandlwana was such a disaster, they expanded and blew up the heroism and the greatness, in a sense, of Rorke's Drift to try to get people away from the thoughts of what was happening happened at Isandlwana. So, and part of that, they gave, I think, eventually about a dozen VCs to those that were at Rorke's Drift. And there was controversy, some saying that many of them didn't deserve it. The Lieutenant Chard and Lieutenant Bromhead, a lot of them said were dullards. They should never have got anything. And it was really only the James Dalton who was the hero of the place, but he didn't get a VC. He's the one that actually did something. He supervised the barricades going up. He was the one that actually is the hero of Rorke's Drift. If he didn't do what he did, then they would have been slaughtered. But there's an interesting couple pages in this afterward. Saul David talks about what happened to a number of the VCs. It's sort of typical in the army, like they use them as propaganda in some ways to prop up, British pride and everything like that, and then didn't follow through with the ones that they said were heroes. And here it goes. It's like, what of the other heroes who survived the war? Sadly, as is often the case, the ordinary soldiers were quickly forgotten. Of the 7 non-officers who won VCs at Rorke's Drift, 3 fared particularly badly. Corporal Christian Sykes, having recovered from his wound, worked for a time in the telegraph office in Durban, but by 1884 he was out of work and destitute. In the hope of a fresh start, he accepted a free passage to England on HMS Serapis. Tragically, he died en route and was buried at sea. Private Robert Jones, one of the Hospital 4, left the army in 1888 and worked intermittently as an agricultural laborer. Unable to provide for his family, he shot himself in the back garden of his home in Peterchurch, Hertfordshire, in 1898. He was buried in the local graveyard, but because it was thought he had committed suicide, his gravestone faces in the opposite direction to the other plots. Now, his family has said that it wasn't suicide, it was an accident, it was a hair trigger. And then Jones's namesake, the man who fought by his side, Private William Jones, was invalided out of the army with chronic rheumatism in 1880 and failed to find regular employment. He was reduced to reenacting the defense of Rorke's Drift in theaters and even appeared in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show when it toured Britain in the 1880s. But penury forced him to pawn his VC, and by 1912, reoccurring nightmares about Zulus had unhinged his mind. He died the following year and was buried in a public grave. Corporal William Allen never properly recovered from his wound, though he served for a time as a sergeant instructor of musketry in the 4th Volunteer Battalion of the South Wales Borderers. He died of influenza in March 1890. Private Frederick Hitch was also discharged on account of serious injuries he received at Rorke's Drift. He joined the Corps of Commissionaries, but had his VC stolen off the front of his coat in 1901. It was never recovered, though King Edward VII authorized replacement in 1908. Hitch later became a cab driver and died at home in Cheswick during a taxi strike in 1913. Private Henry Hook returned home in 1880 to learn that his wife, believing him dead, had sold his property and remarried. He moved to London and worked for many years as the cloakroom attendant in the reading room of the British Library. He died of tuberculosis in Gloucester in 1904. Private John Williams outlived his fellow VC winners. Discharged from the Army Reserve in 1893, he worked for many years as a civilian in the regimental depot at Brecon, finally retiring in 1920. He died in Corbon in 1932 at the age of 75. Of the 4 officers who received the VCs for Rorke's Drift, James Reynolds lived the longest. Promoted to Sergeant Major, he was present at the Battle of Olunde and eventually died aged 88 in 1932. Gonville Bromhead did not fare as so well. The Queen obviously forgave him for not accepting the invitation of Balmoral, although he was never invited again because she later sent him a signed photograph of herself. But true to form, he failed to take professional advantage of his fame and did not rise above the rank of major. He never married and saw out the remainder of his army career in South Asia, serving in Burma in the late 1880s and finally succumbing to enteric fever at Allahabad, India in 1891. He was just 45. John Chard also remained a bachelor, though his career was marginally more successful than Bromhead's. He had just been promoted to full colonel when he died of cancer of the mouth, having earlier had his tongue removed in 1897. the Queen remained devotee to the end, inquiring after his health and later sending a wreath of laurel leaves with a handwritten card, a mark of admiration and regard for a brave soldier. The premature and unremarked death of James Dalton, the real hero of Rorke's Drift, could not have been more of a contrast. In December 1879, having just recovered from his wounds, he was promoted to assistant commissary and put out to grass on half pay. With his army career effectively over, he sailed for England in early 1880 and quickly faded into obscurity. He later returned to South Africa as a civilian and stalked a claim in the newly discovered goldfields of Witwatersrand. But his little best mind failed to prosper, and he died of a sudden illness in Port Elizabeth Hotel in 1897. Mourners were in short supply. So, the VCs, the recipients of the VCs, were used as sort of a smokescreen, in a sense, to try to get people to the public to, forget or get them to look otherwise to the disaster of Isandlwana. Many didn't think a lot of them agreed to get it, but it's clear that the public and the government really didn't care about them, except a couple of the officers that the Queen wanted to, because they were officers and they were privates. They were forgotten. So it's very telling. There were two, as I mentioned, there was two films that were made. Zulu in 1964 for Rorke's Drift. Michael Caine played Brumhead, and Stanley Baker played Chard. Yes, I think that's the order. And interesting characterizations. But the movie had a sort of, I believe, an anti-war theme to it. It's been seen by many as many things, but I think misunderstood in many ways. I think it's a fabulous film. The events are pretty close to what happened as far as I can remember. It's many years since I've seen it. The Hook character, though, was very different in the film. He was, if I remember right, he was considered to be layabout, a drunk, and he was up on reprimand, and he was in the hospital to forced sort of confinement, which in reality, Hook was a teetotaler, and his job was to work in the hospital to help care at that time for the sick soldiers that were in the hospital. So that wasn't very accurate, and I don't remember too much about character James Durant. I don't know if they really underplayed him or not, and the surgeon maybe as well, the doctor. But all in all, I thought it was a good film. Now we spin ahead, or move ahead to 1979 with Zulu Dawn. Peter O'Toole played Chelmsford. He actually played it quite well. He played pompous, as you'd expect, a pompous aristocrat, playing war. When he was actually out of his depth, which it sounds like Chelmsford actually was, because Chelmsford, his criticism was that he wasn't a really good soldier. Others said they hope they never, are under his command again. He wouldn't send out people to scout properly. He was afraid that they were going to get hurt, which is understandable, but he wasn't a good soldier that needed to be a soldier at the time. Denham Elliott played Colonel Pauline, who was in charge of Isandlwana camp while Chelmsford was away. Burt Lancaster played Lieutenant Colonel Durnford. But they changed the character again, or they changed events of where the Zulu were coming from, and they had a confrontation between Chelmsford and Durnford before Chelmsford went out on his jaunt, and because Durnford disobeyed orders. None of that ever happened, but I guess it made maybe a little more sense for the filmmakers to try to maybe put blame on him as well. But anyway, I'm up to 30 minutes here, and I think that's about all I have to say about this. Well, there's much more that can be said, but I was trying, like I say, broad strokes. And hope to speak to you soon, BookTube. Bye.